So I use a really broad definition of channeling, which is the process of accessing information and energy that's not limited by our conventional notions of time and space, and that these processes can appear receptive and also expressive. Now, that's a very broad umbrella definition, but these channeling experiences occur on a spectrum. And so on one side, you might have things like intuition, knowing the future, having gut hunches. And on the other side, you have more rare experiences like mediumship and what I call trance channeling, which is a subcategory of this broader channeling. So in trance channeling, the channeler believes that their body is used as a vehicle for a non-physical entity to speak through them. So usually they go into some level of trance and give permission and allow a supposed non-physical being to actually use their bodies to communicate, to move, to write, etc. Now, this is slightly different from what's called mental mediumship, which is the medium believes that they receive messages from deceased people and other non-physical beings, but the message is heard usually internally in their mind, and then they translate it. They transmit what they hear to the person they're talking to. So the main difference between the two is that the trance channeler their body is actually the vehicle for the being to communicate directly, whereas in the mental mediumship, they're hearing something and then translating what they're hearing. And there's lots of nuances to both of those, but that's the main difference. Well, what many people don't know is that formal research on mediumship has actually been done for about 150 years. So in the late 1800s, there was a huge upswelling of interest in these phenomenon in the spiritualist movement, which was a religious movement, and people had seances and practiced mediumship quite regularly. So there was much research that began at that time to assess if the information that was coming through these mediums at seances was actually verifiable, if they were actually getting true information about these deceased people. Now, that research was done very methodically in a qualitative way. They would record, etc. Only recently have we been able to apply our modern tools and techniques to the study of mediumship, looking at brain waves, heart waves, different hormones, and what is actually happening when the mediums are giving their sessions. Many people want to know the source. They want to get to the definitive proof of whether mediums and channelers are actually speaking to deceased humans or these non-physical beings. My sense is that with the tools we have today, definitively proving that this is true is going to be very, very challenging. So I'm more focused on the mechanisms or how it actually works. Why is it that one person is able to receive highly accurate information, whether it's from their higher self or a deceased person, we don't know, but they still have this skill? What is it about them that allows them to do that? How does it actually work when they go in and out of their trance states? And how can we learn from that to support more people to be able to tap into their inner wisdom and their intuition? If you think of the broader definition of channeling, I propose that all humans have the capacity to channel in some way, whether it's those intuitive gut hunches or a knowingness, an inner knowingness, or gaining information about some people, but those are the more common types of channeling. When you talk about mediumship and trance channeling, it is definitely more rare. From the surveys that we've done, it's probably about 10 to 15% of the people that we survey say that they have had these types of experiences. So I'm very curious about this research question of whether there is a genetic component to the types of abilities that people have. And you hear anecdotes of how it runs in families. And you hear about, in Scotland, this idea of second sight runs in families as well. There was a researcher in the United Kingdom who actually formally studied this and mapped out pedigrees of families and found a clear familial transmission. They also did the same with surveys. In the many surveys that we've done, it's very clear that there is some familial component. As far as we know, we've done the only official genetic study to actually test this in a small pilot with 13 high-functioning psychics and controls. Now, these were not specifically mediums and trance channelers. They had a wide variety of abilities, but we found a unique difference in their genetic code. So the psychics had a region in what's called the non-coding region of the DNA. We used to call it the junk DNA, but now we know that that portion of the DNA moderates, modulates, and helps with the expression of protein synthesis. So we found a difference between those two groups on the non-coding DNA. And this one specific region is highly expressed in the brain. It's also throughout the body as well. We're really excited about this result and want to keep moving forward with this research to see if we can replicate it and see if we can tease apart the different abilities and if those have different aspects in the genetic code. The mental health of channelers has been studied by many researchers, and because when we look at psychiatric diagnoses, there are pieces in there that look very similar to trance channeling. There's one especially called dissociative identity disorder, where a different personality is essentially coming through the person, which is what trance channeling looks like. Another is psychotic symptoms, hearing things that other people don't hear, seeing things that other people don't see. So numerous researchers have studied mediums and trance channelers to see if they have greater symptoms than regular people who don't have those skills. And overwhelmingly, they have found that yes, they do have slightly more symptoms, but that they do not reach clinical levels. So a mental health professional would not be worried about them. They are also incredibly high functioning. They live meaningful and functional lives. So this connection between mental health and these abilities is unfounded. So you're not crazy if you have these experiences. What we know about how the channeling process works is mostly from subjective information, so people telling us what it's like for them. There have been numerous physiological studies that have given us results about what's happening in the brain, in the body, but those are few and don't have consistent findings. So one common theme is that people find themselves in an altered state of consciousness. How they get there is also unique to them. Some people listen to music, some people meditate, some people have other rituals that support them to get into an altered state of consciousness. And then once in that altered state of consciousness, there is an intention to connect, and the connection happens. And the way people have often described it is they feel tingling, or they feel energetic rush, or sometimes people feel pressure in their head or their mind, and then they open up to their channeling ability, and then it comes through. So the most common type of information is personal guidance. So let's say someone is come to a medium and they want information about their life or about a loved one. So personal guidance to help them in their life, choices that they need to make. Also, information about deceased loved ones is a very common information that comes through. What's called ageless wisdom. So, what is the true nature of reality, of our being here on this planet, of the purpose of humanity, of the foundations that support us to grow and evolve and experience on this planet. The type of information comes through as well. Information about the sitter's health and also healing. Less common is scientific and technological information. That does come through also, but it is less common. There's actually quite a bit of variation in terms of the levels of trance or altered state that people are in for the various forms of channeling. And when you hear the term trance channeler, you would assume that they are in a pretty deep trance. In the past, there have been stories of trance channelers who experience themselves just falling asleep. It's like they're completely falling asleep, and when they come back, they have to be told what happened when they were in a trance state. Most of the channelers I know today, trance channelers, do not have that experience. They describe it as stepping aside, that they essentially step aside and the channeling happens and they're observing it. They're like observers watching what's being said, but they are not asleep. Now, many trance channelers have also said that they don't remember the information. So even though they're observing it and know what's being said while it's happening, if you ask them the next day, do you remember what was said to this person, they'll have just very vague memories of it. I don't know what the mechanism is behind that, but I'm really curious to be able to find that out eventually through our research. So when we did our most recent study, we created these two scales. One was the level of consciousness so that we could really capture this variation in how deep the person went into trance. And the other was level of incorporation. So you might be wondering, what is that? So the trance channelers, because they believe that this non-physical being is using their body, the perception is that the being is actually entering their body energetically. And so some trance channelers say, well, it takes over my body completely. other trance channelers say, oh, I just feel it in my head. So we had this idea to measure this level of incorporation. How much did the channeler feel the being was incorporated into their own body on a scale of 0 to 100? Most trance channelers, it is a consensual process that channelers give permission for it to happen, and that's what allows it to occur. We're really curious about what was happening in the body during trance channeling. If any of you have observed trance channeling, you will remember how changed the person seems when they are in a trance channeling state. So I thought, of course the physiology must be different. How can we test if that's so? So we brought trance channelers to our laboratory and hooked them up to devices that collect brain waves, heart waves, changes in the skin, temperature, and we had them go in and out of a channeling state every 5 minutes, and we had them repeat this on 2 days. Then when we did our analysis, we looked at the body physiology during the channeling sessions compared to the non-channeling sessions to see if there were differences. We found that for the most part there were not differences between the channeling state and the non-channeling state. There was one measure, the voice measure, that we did find a difference in. So when the channeler first sat down, we had them read a story, a standardized story in a non-channeling state, and then we had them read it again in a channeling state. And when we compared the voice frequencies of them reading that story, we did see a significant difference in the frequency of the voice. There are numerous cases in parapsychology that have been rigorously vetted, where trance channelers have spoken languages that they couldn't possibly know. For example, Hindi or Tibetan or Icelandic, various languages spoken through trance channelers that our normal mind can't imagine how that could possibly be so. Glossolalia and xenoglossy refer to speaking in tongues, if you will. So imagine a English-speaking trance channeler, and a supposed being comes through that speaks in a completely different language. Portuguese, Spanish, French, even some ancient languages have been spoken through trance channelers. It's hard to explain how a trance channeler who only knows English, who's only been exposed to English, could produce accurate speaking in a completely different language. This brings us back to this debate about whether the source of the channeled information really is a discarnate non-physical being, or perhaps the human mind, in some way that we don't quite understand, has access to all the information that all humans have on the planet, again through some psychic means, but not necessarily because it is an actual being who is communicating through them. So some might argue that there is this reservoir of all information, and all the channeler needs to do is tap into that. I would argue that that in and of itself is quite remarkable, and if that was so, how can we access that level of knowledge? Our current dominant paradigm, the materialistic paradigm, believes that our consciousness is limited to our physical brain, so that the only thing that we have awareness of is housed in our skull. And yet we see through things like mediumship and trance channeling, regardless of if it's an actual non-physical being or not, that these people have access to information that they couldn't possibly know through their traditional five senses, through what they know through their own mind. So it challenges the materialistic paradigm and gives us impetus to keep moving forward to discover the actual confines, if there are any, of our consciousness, and this concept of non-local consciousness, because there's so much evidence from various parapsychology studies and phenomenon that our consciousness goes beyond time and space and can access information halfway across the globe, or from the past or from the future. And I'm really excited and passionate about moving that work forward and moving into a post-materialist paradigm where we can see that our consciousness is non-local and not housed in our brain. Meditation is one of the strongest predictors, along with belief, for having channeling experiences in daily life and also doing better on laboratory tasks. If you think about meditation, it's this incredible practice where we work with the mind. It is like a workout for our mind muscle, if you will. It takes practice and consistency, but with that, we can train our mind to be still and quiet and open, which is not the normal state of most people nowadays. Our mind is very busy and bombarded with external information. So this practice of meditation to learn how to still and quiet our mind, once we're in that place, most often people experience their consciousness to expand beyond themselves. And I think is a pathway to support people to open up to those capacities within themselves. We did a survey of meditators from around the world and asked them if they had experienced any channeling phenomenon during their meditation practices, and the majority of them said yes. So meditation is very conducive to channeling, and I think is a pathway to support people to open up to those capacities within themselves. The definitions for meditation vary depending on who you ask, but there is a common element of being aware of what's happening in the mind. And mindfulness meditation is a type of meditation. It is a specific practice that's focused on the present moment and focusing on the present moment in a non-judgmental way with intention and awareness. Meditation is incredibly trendy right now. When I first started in clinical research, I was interested in meditation and studying meditation, and it was an uphill battle to try to get research studies funded to bring it into clinical practice. When I moved from my academic institute 8 years later, mindfulness meditation was on the cover of Time magazine and was everywhere. Executives in boardrooms were practicing mindfulness meditation. With the explosion of meditation has come incredible research on meditation and how it works and what's happening in the body when we are meditating. The most common findings in meditation compared to non-meditating is that we see increased alpha and theta waves in the brain. These are the slower brain waves. We also see increased parasympathetic activation, which means the heart rate slows down. We have increased variability in the heartbeat. It engages our rest and relax aspect of our nervous system, allows us to downshift, if you will. And this is incredibly helpful to counteract the chronic stress that many of us face today, which triggers the fight or flight part of our nervous system and is the root of many chronic illnesses. In the past, to learn meditation, you needed to have a very vigilant, long practice over many, many years to be able to achieve states called samadhi, or these oneness states, the transcendent states. With our current technology and what we know about meditative states today, we can use something called neurofeedback. And I think that's really where the next step in meditation research should be. How do we take what we've learned from the meditation research that has come thus far to support people to get into these transcendent meditative states without needing to practice for 20 years? How do we support them to access those states more quickly and thus reap the benefits of being in that transcendent state? And I think that will also support moving into the post-materialistic paradigm, because if people have a direct experience of their consciousness not being confined to their physical brain, that will increase the number of people who have felt that and support the paradigm to shift more easily.